We'll just see how it goes. Okay. So I'm with Zeyn Joukhadar, the author of The 30 Names of Night. And I was wondering if we could, yay! I was wondering if we could start
Yay!
by, if you wouldn't mind just like introducing yourself quickly and introduce.
Or I can just drop a book. I can just drop a book
So
also.
slapstick.
Yeah.
And just introducing the book a little bit. Oh, I did have a question. We don't want spoilers, I assume, right? So we'll stay away from
Okay, no
spoilers.
spoilers. No spoilers.
Okay, but I have been kind of curious about. I'm gonna just do this all out of order because I'm just thinking this way, but
That's fine. That's fine.
actually, what like was it your decision or did people just? I kind of thought that the narrator's name was like a mystery, but then I just saw it written about like all over the place. Did you have any feelings about it or were you sort of fine?
Yeah,
Like,
I mean, I actually we had a discussion about this with my editor and the team at Atria, just because I had made the decision, during the writing of the book that I really wanted to have this. Well, actually, I can just grab it and show that I really wanted there to be this, let's say, awareness in the reader that the character was withholding his birth name, his dead name. And so these having these crossouts at the start of his chapters were like a conscious decision that I made going in. Um, but I knew that like when it came time to write the copy for the jacket and everything like that, I did think that it made sense to be able to talk about the character with the name that he chose for himself, and I didn't really think of it as a mystery. If anything, I was sort of trying to say to the reader that like the name itself is not the mystery, like not the birth, not the death name, the dead name or the birth name, not the new name. It's just that there needs to be an awareness that the character is existing and the reader is therefore existing with the character in this space, between the time when he decides to choose a new name for himself and the time when he actually chooses that name, so that we're in this in between space, this liminal space with the character. And the crossouts serve to make us aware of that one, but also to give the character agency in saying, the reader, a cis reader wanting to know this dead name, is itself something that I'm pushing back against.
and how so, since we're talking about this, what about the other crossouts? Because you have other crossouts with
Mm-hmm.
the other narrative, like the other timeline, and I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit too.
Yeah. So yeah, actually, while we're talking about this, I'm gonna like try to cover up some of the text so there's no spoilers. But yeah, so there are like lines that are actually whole paragraphs that are crossed out later on in the book, and this being a book with two timelines, um, one of which is epistolary because it's this found journal of the Syrian American bird artist Layla Z. What I was trying to get at, I think, was that the characters in this book are trying to take control of their own narratives, and one of these narratives is a historical one. And so this found journal that is sort of becomes a historical document, um, is a diary, right? This journal, that somebody wrote years and years ago and is found. But this person, being a queer person, and I've talked about this publicly elsewhere, so I don't think it's necessarily a spoiler to say it, but this person, Layla Z, was very conscious, as many queer people are, about what she's putting in her diary and what she wants people to read about her. And so these crossouts are her way of trying, even as she's writing in her own journal, which supposedly no one else is supposed to see. There's an awareness that if someone does see certain things, she still wants to have some control over what people know about her. And I think it's sort of ambiguous as to whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. There's like her sort of setting boundaries and trying to have some control over the narrative about her, but there's also this self-censorship as a queer person where she doesn't feel safe having, even just writing something down and leaving it there feels unsafe. So there's these two characters that are both erasing for different reasons, and and yet trying to get at the same thing, which is just autonomy over their stories and their narratives. And I mean, I think that's something that we're not often afforded, and especially queer and trans people are not afforded that often in the historical archive. And if there are erasures made, we are not always the ones that get to choose where and when to make those erasures, or those sort of what's the word I'm looking for? What we get to like not didact. What's the word that I'm looking for? Redactions.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's one of those days.
It reminds, like, have you seen the TV show Gentleman Jack? Have you seen that show? The British.
I haven't.
Okay, so I forget what her actual name.
Now I'm gonna go watch it though.
Okay, so it's one of the. It's based on a true story, but it's about this woman who's like one of the earliest like women landowners in England, and is a lesbian, and she actually created this whole all of these symbols in her diary to secretly discuss all of the like relationships she was having with other women, because she knew that, you know, like she could possibly be killed, or, you know, just like all of these possible violences could happen to her if they found out that she was gay. And she had, you know, long-term like live-in partnerships with other women. And let me actually, but she had created this whole like system of symbols to write in her diary. So anyone who reads, like, it's not even in like a like known language. Let me find out what her name is real quick. But I think that, and that's not something that has, I mean, I don't think I'm up to date with the show, but that's not something that's even come out that much. But I was like doing some Ann Lister, yeah. So around the Industrial Revolution. So her name is Ann Lister.
Oh, that's really cool.
But I was thinking about that as you were talking, just, you know, how do queer and trans people like create archives for themselves and for other trans and queer people, like going forward, but still maintain this sense of safety around it. Especially given that historically, I mean, we're still in danger, but historically, obviously the danger was even more clear and more prevalent. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Well, I'm definitely going to check that show out.
It's a fun lesbian.
But yeah, and I think it's hard to like, yeah, I think it's hard to assign like a value judgment to that, right? Like, I think there's in some way, I don't know, maybe not all of us, but some of us, I think we often desire a sort of neat way of assigning like a positive or negative connotation to these things of like, well, we should be able to do X, Y, or Z, or, you know, it's bad if we do this, or it's good if we do this. And it's sort of like, I don't know, like, are the erasures that are in the book good or bad? I don't know. All I know is that like we so often have control over those things, even if it's just, and like, as you said, if it's a safety issue, but also even if it's just like the way that we want things to be known about us or not known about us to like people that are close to us, or like how we talk about this with our parents and our grandparents and other generations. I mean, that was a big part of the book too, was like, what do you do when you don't necessarily share the language with older generations around queerness and transness? And also when you don't even necessarily primarily speak the same language. Like if you have grandparents or parents that speak, that are native speakers of a different language, like in this case, Arabic, and the way that like sometimes, you know, for example, in this book, like there's multiple characters that sort of use English, whether knowingly or unknowingly, there can be uses of English that turn into like a power play against the parents because they are the ones that speak it better, or they're able to sort of talk back or argue back in a way that the parent can't quite respond to or can't access. And how just like, I don't think I can't make any like sort of conclusive, like, you know, I'm not trying to say anything, let's say, conclusive about it, except to say that like these are really fraught dynamics, you know, and that queerness is one of those things that like hopefully, you know, we all want to like be able to talk about I don't know if we all want that, but for those of us who do want to be able to talk about this with our parents, with our grandparents, with our extended families, especially if we come from immigrant families, language in so many different ways becomes like a possible helpful tool. It becomes a point of contention. It becomes like a power thing, a power dynamic. And yeah, it's just really complicated, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
I was thinking about this is sort of connected to my next question. Certainly, like, names are really powerful in this book, and not just in terms of transness, but I was also thinking about the way that names figure for immigrants too, because not only, especially like thinking about like how many people had to change their name when they changed their surnames when they came over here, or I'm thinking about my father who, well, like Chinese people tend to just create American names for themselves when they come over here, because they don't even like that's their way of sort of dealing with the pronunciation issue. I assume it's different now, but I remember when I was younger, my stepsisters, they just would pick a name, like just any name that they wanted. My eldest stepsister's boyfriend, his name was Peter because the first thing he ate when he came to the States was like Peter Pan peanut butter. And so I was just like, so I was wondering, like, beyond Nadir's like journey to discovering what his name is, like how do you feel that names are important in other ways in the book?
Yeah, I mean, so this is an issue that gets briefly talked about in the book too, where the family does have their surname changed, and even some of the characters have their first names changed. And that definitely happened in the Arab American community too, for sure. I think it's especially like a thorny thing for trans people trying to decide when they change their name, trying to decide how to choose the name. Like there's so many different rationales, and we don't have to get into that now, but I think for Nader, when he's trying to figure out what his name is, like part of the book is just taking us on the journey of the fact that he's in figuring out the name. What he's actually trying to figure out is what is important to him and who is important to him, and what can he claim as legacy, I guess, is one way of thinking about it. And I think that names as a kind of way of honoring legacy is one of the themes of the book. And so in the end, like Nader means something to him in terms of, so it means rare in Arabic. And a lot of I'm trying to like do this without giving spoilers, so I'm like I'm choosing my words very carefully.
I mean, it's up to you. Do you prefer like, do you have feelings about, I just assumed you didn't want the spoilers, but do you have feelings about?
No, I can definitely definitely avoid spoilers.
If you want to. I just always think that the author doesn't want things spoiled. But if we like do spoilers, then I have all kinds of questions for you.
Well, it's up to you. We can also cut them out later if I accidentally let something slip. But I was going to say that just like, because this book is really about this search on the surface anyway, right? It's about this search for this rare bird that Nader's mother, who was an ornithologist, saw before her death, and that also this bird artist Layla Z saw like 60 years earlier. And so this bird links them. And this bird is described consistently as being this rare bird, and more specifically as meaning something to the people who saw it, especially in terms of the fact that they saw this bird and then were not believed about it. Like there's a whole thing about how, like, for example, like the third person, there were like 3 people who saw this bird, and the third person was an ornithologist, but he was Black. And so like his colleagues were basically like, we don't believe you. this bird artist and also Nether's mother were both women, and so they were also sort of written off as like, oh, we don't believe that you saw this bird because no one else has seen it. And so like there's this whole theme around like who is actually listened to, one, who gets listened to, and two, like who gets listened to even when they're talking about themselves. And so I think like for Nether to choose this name meaning rare and potentially having that be in reference to the bird, in a way, what he's really trying to say is that he is the rare bird that's not supposed to exist, right? He's the rare bird that everybody says, we don't believe you in terms of your own experience about yourself and the way that you experience the world. Excuse me. So I think that like, given that there is this theme of like, well, what is the legacy that you're claiming and who are you claiming? The name, what I really love about the name is that he's not only saying all of that about that the fact that he's listening to himself, in spite of other people not listening to his own experiences of himself, but he's also claiming his mother's legacy in terms of saying like, I believe you that you did see this bird. He's claiming the legacy of this queer bird artist whose journal he finds, and I won't spoil how they're connected, but that is also connected to him and to his family. And so like the name becomes a way to actually claim this sort of queer legacy that is much greater than a sort of blood family legacy. And I think that I really, really, I think means something to me, that like, I think it's a good reminder that a name can also be a way of claiming people and things and experiences that also lie beyond the scope of what society tells us we sort of belong to by blood, right? That like our family, our sense of like who our family is can be much greater than who our blood family is, and our sense of like how we construct home can be much more, can encompass much more and be much more inclusive than the traditional sense of like, you build your home within like the sort of, like cis heteronormative patriarchal structure of marriage and all of these things. So I think there's also that, and like the fact that can be if not included in, then at least sort of gestured toward in a name is also, I think, really cool.
Yeah, I also really love how in the Layla Z timeline, we also have like a different idea of a family structure with the child that comes into her life as well. So that which I just really loved those particular details, because I feel like, not that those don't happen in like cishet novels, but I just feel like there's like a little wink also to queer and trans people and how like the different ways one can like conceive of and like construct a family unit.
Yeah, totally. It's funny, no one ever asks about, well, maybe because it's a spoiler and we can cut this out if we need to, but like no one has ever asked me about that part of the book in particular, actually, like about how the child actually comes into their life and how there is like some conflict, I guess you could say, right? Like between Layla and Ilyas, they're not on the same page initially about like, that this is like a gift and a blessing that they could choose to take their lives in a certain direction together. But like even in Layla herself, like even being somewhat aware of her queerness, like there's this reticence, there's this like big hesitation that she has because of her own internalized queer phobia, that she's like, well, but I don't know if like maybe this is okay for other people, but is it okay for me? And I don't know, I like that it's not simple, I guess. I like that there's some room for these characters. I mean, I guess what I was hoping for is that there would be room for these characters to find their way into self-acceptance, that like a lot of people, not a lot of people, but some people who have reviewed the book have been like, but everything is just so positive, and like there's a happy ending. And so like, you know, I expected it to be more complicated somehow, or there's an expectation of trauma and sad endings. And I think part of that is just like, that's what we get a lot of the time, you know, as queer and trans people, like that we get all these sad endings and trauma, but like, and there are a lot of heavy things and like dark things that happen in the book, but I like the fact that like the characters they actively have to make the choice to choose their happy ending. Like it doesn't come necessarily naturally to any of them. And I think that's probably more, I don't know, realistic, you know?
No, I really love that about the book in general, actually, because we do just have so many tragic queer and trans stories, and
Yeah.
and they serve a very like important. I think they serve a really important purpose, and certainly did, you know, if we were like going back. But there's something to question around, certainly around not just like going there as authors, but also going there as publishers, like always seeking that like tragic story.
Mm-hmm.
Like
For sure.
the tension around Layla Z creating this like life, you know, with Ilias. It actually reminds me. There's this moment I really love in Stone Bush Blues, and it reminds me of that. I don't remember the name of the character, but when when the main character decides to transition and have top surgery, and she's like, and the partner's like, I've worked way too hard to fight for being discriminated against as a lesbian, and like had this real like tension within herself about being seen as like a cishet pairing, even though her partner was trans. And so I think that those tensions are so important because it's just really complicated, and I think it's complicated in a way that the like average cishet readership probably that there's just layers to it, and some of those layers are external and some of those layers are like internal. And so I really like that timeline.
Yeah.
I mean, I am curious about, I don't know if this is too long a question, but how this whole book came
for
to
it.
be. like which narrative did you start with? Did you know you were going to work with this these dual timelines? Was the second timeline coming out of like actual research that you found in Arab American histories of queer and trans people, or is this like your way of sort of like giving a nod to what exists? So I'm just sort of curious, like the whole like the birthing of this book and the way it's kind of conceived now.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I'll try to like answer it in as much of a nutshell as I can, because the reality is that like this book went through so many different iterations before it actually. Is this the book? Did it finally come? I love you. I think a finished copy of my book has just been dropped on my desk. Should we find out?
Yes, we should. That would be amazing.
Oh my God, it is. Oh my God.
Oh my God, I can't believe this just happened.
This is like, this interview is now like epic proportions. This is literally, it's like a live unboxing.
Oh my God, I cannot believe
it.
This happened.
It's the only copy I have. Live on air. Thank you. Oh my God.
Said I
haven't cool.
So yet. I assumed you were talking about like a new book. I was like, what do you mean? Because you must have your actual book. Yay.
No, I don't, but I do now.
Oh my God.
In the last 5 seconds. Well, that was cool. Okay. We have to do an interview all the time.
Yeah.
Some random blessing will just fall into my lap. So back to answering my question.
I know. Yeah. That's amazing.
So that was pretty cool. Okay. So where was I? So basically the novel went through a lot of different iterations and forms over like gosh, 5 years, 4 years. And it took me a really long time. And actually, there was a long time where I wasn't really sure that it was going to come together. And I was like, why did I like sell this novel before it was completely finished? I was like, I actually said to myself, I think at a couple of points, like, what if this is one of those novels that like becomes this giant like mountain of material, but it never comes together? And um, and I couldn't figure out, mostly, like, I knew that I wanted two timelines, and I knew that I wanted to tell a story that was about how history is present with us and how we need to know our history in order to build our future, and finding chosen family, and building from that. So I knew that those were the main themes. um, but I think one of the problems was starting with a theme rather than an actual sort of premise that will drive a plot, is that you still have to build the engine. And I find that I often, well, I don't know, I can't really say that often. I don't know what is often, but like with this book, I had trouble with that part. I had trouble with figuring out, how am I going to address this particular theme with an engine that will maintain tension. Just because a lot of the book was this character interacting with New York and with the people that were close to them, so as to talk about a particular New York, I suppose you could say. Um, but I mean, and while that, there are a lot of really lovely literary novels that do that, and obviously this is a literary novel in that vein, but at the same time, I did feel that I had trouble getting it to move. I had trouble getting the characters to move. I mean, especially like the protagonist. Not that in the early drafts of the novel was just like impossible to get him to do anything. And I mean, I know like a lot of writers will say that, like, why are you not doing what I want you to do? But it was really impossible. Like, he was so isolated and he was so cut off, and just was like, did not want to talk to anyone. And I think that, now looking back, I can understand why that was, because in the early drafts of the book, the character, I didn't feel that I was ready to out myself and make this character trans. And so, if originally I was like, well, I'll just write about a queer cis woman and it'll be sort of safe. And I felt that it would be more safe for me. And I just, as I was workshopping the book, actually, I was at Vona. I remember someone who's now like one of my best friends said in front of the group, like, there's all this stuff about, basically, like, in a nutshell, like, there's all this stuff about gender in here, but it's not addressed. And I had this moment where I was kind of like, oh God, like, I can't escape it. Like, it's in the text, like, whether I want to acknowledge it or not, like, this character is giving clear signals that this is what's going on for them. And of course, I was also like, not entirely aware of this, but I was like about to start my own transition. And so I think all this is just to say that, like, I tried to just follow this character on the journey that he needed to go on, which ended up being a different journey than I went on, right? Like, it's not an autobiographical thing. Um, but I also eventually, it was through a lot of conversations with other writers, especially, that I remember I had one conversation with another writer when I was briefly living in Beirut, and we were talking about migration. And I think that, like, some of those conversations about returning to the the themes that had made me want to write the book, about, like, well, I do want to talk about movement, and I do want to talk about, like, movement between generations and between genders, and between gender presentations, and between names and all of this, like, that finally allowed me to see that I needed the birds to have a greater role in the book. And I think it was actually the birds that ended up bringing it together. That was the thing that finally made me see, oh, okay, I have the architecture in here, and now I understand how to tell this story, and that this is the main search that needs to happen. But that, I mean, it's hard to talk about that process in a way that sounds at all linear, mostly because it wasn't linear. It was a total mess.
So I know that, like, I've written an epistolary, like, narrative novel, so I know not only that they're difficult, but also that they're really hard to sell. Like they're really hard to get people on board with them because
Yeah.
publishers and agents are always worried about the being able to carry the momentum. But you have, like epistolary two really complex narratives, including ornithology and history. And so I was wondering, like, what do you think was like the real challenge of taking on like such a complicated structure, and in mainstream literary fiction. This is not like like a tiny weird experimental press, so this is also still trying to be like really kind of palatable for like the average reader also.
Mhm.
So I was just like wondering, what was your sort of journey with that too?
Yeah, actually, that's a really good question, and I kind of feel like it's a question it's a thing we should talk about more in general, like as writers. Like I think sometimes there's a feeling that it's like taboo to talk about that, of like, well, how do you, like, if you want this to be marketable in a certain kind of way, like how do you take something that could very easily be seen as too experimental to be a certain kind of book? And I think that the thing, are you okay? Okay, no, there was somebody who fell, but they're okay.
Oh,
I think the thing that made it possible, for it to, like, let's say, be literary but mainstream enough, or to a certain extent, was just the pacing and the maintenance of tension, and that was probably the hardest part of the book. I mean, I think it was very clear to me throughout the writing of the book that it wanted to be very literary and weird, and
yeah.
I wanted it to be weird. I mean, I knew that I was writing a weird book, even from like the very early stages, when I was like to my agent, I was like, I think I'm writing this thing that's like about this, and it sounds completely off the wall, but I really love it. Um, and I think like that was part of the reason why I rewrote it so many times, because I couldn't, I didn't want to have um, a, a plot engine, and like for the primary quest of the book, that felt forced. And so I knew that it had to be something very specific, and something that was probably going to veer into like the fabulist, but it still needed to, it needed to have enough weight. And anyway, this is all basically just to say that like I had to wrestle with it a lot, and there are a lot of drafts of me trying not to sacrifice tension to at the like atmospheric qualities of the novel, and also not vice versa. um I think that the only way that it worked in the end is actually just I had to invest a lot into my own understanding of the characters' internal emotional motivations, and I also kept having to return to history, um because I think in the end, like, it was the history that gave the weight, like, and the gravitas to what was going on in the present day story. And that, I mean, I think now I'm finally answering something you asked earlier, that like that was where I found the greatest richness of all of the stuff that I uncovered, that I ended up needing to know to write this book, was in the archives. For example, at the Arab American National Museum, I was an artist in residence there in 2019, and I had access to their oral history archives and their newspaper archives. And I mean, let me tell you, like, there's some amazing stuff um, that I went through. I mean, I listened to so many oral histories, for example, of Arab auto workers in Detroit. Um, and I think, like, I mean, I've told this story in other interviews, so it's not like now it's sort of like, I'm like, man, I don't know, I'm surprised, I guess, at myself as to how much this touched me, but it really did touch me, and I think that's why I tell this story so often. That like, there was a moment where I was listening to these oral histories, and I came across a recording of someone who said, who described themselves as a woman, as a cis woman, but didn't use that language, but said, I'm a female auto worker, and I was in this business, and I worked with all of these men, and I dealt with a lot of misogyny and sexism and a lot of harassment, and she talked about her experiences that were by themselves were pretty like incredible to listen to, but also like just listening to her talk. I don't know, obviously, if this person was queer or not, but I felt that I maybe recognized some speech patterns that I felt familiar with
Mm.
from, all of the other like queer women and butch women that I know in my own life. And so I knew in that moment, I was like, look, I don't know anything about this person, but like, what if though, right? I mean, and even if not this person, like, surely there were queer people in this time and in this place. And I think that that moment of interacting with the archive and being like, it's not all written down. It couldn't all be written down, but I know that we were there, and that like in some way this book, I suppose you could see this book as being my attempt at making a contribution to, or I guess encouraging us to reimagine the archive and try to fill in some of the blanks of the archive, um, especially I think like for immigrant communities, there's just so much that we couldn't say, like even if we wanted to, you know?
Yeah. No, I love that
Oh
idea.
no, I think you're frozen.
Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Hey, I lost you for a minute.
Okay.
I can hear you. Can you
Okay.
hear me?
Yeah, but am I still frozen? Can
You're
you
still
hear me?
frozen. Am I still frozen?
No, you're not frozen. So weird. So should I just
Okay. Okay, well tell me where I got cut off and I can
Oh,
Okay, now you're good. Now you're good.
you didn't get cut off at all, actually. No, I was just saying that I really love the idea of
Oh, okay.
the archive. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, there's a delay, but we can
Okay.
I'll just like listen and
That
I'll
wasn't
come
good.
in when I can.
But okay, so one question I had, and I'll try to talk around the spoiler, is um, how the two families are how the two timelines are connected. And I'm wondering, given this idea of um, one of the things that gets talked about at the end of the book is that how do I say this? That the person who's connected to the other person believes that they would never find one another because their names were possibly changed and all of that. So I was wondering, did you always know that they would find one another, or was there like a version where we learned their connection but they never reunite?
Actually, there was, which I find really astute that you figured out that there probably was. Yeah, I originally, should I even say this? I don't know. Originally, let's just say that it was very different, and that there was like a family connection, but that it was sort of something that was learned at the beginning, and then it's not necessary for the rest of the book. And I mean, I think that I sort of during some draft of the book, I realized that I was sort of giving away what could be the best piece of tension driving information on the one hand, and also that like I remember having conversations. This was before I was out, when I had like first started drafting the book, and I remember sort of tentatively broaching the possibility of having the ending that currently is in the book. And I remember just getting a lot of pushback from people that were in my life at the time that were, let's say, that were very invested in my being closeted, and being like, you can't have that ending. Like that ending is just like, there's like a high level of queerness in that ending, and like it's risky and it's whatever. And now, I mean, it's like one of the things I love most about the book. But I think that like, again, like I went on a journey to becoming the person that could write this book, I guess is one way of saying it. And I'm really glad that I did, because it would have been well, it wouldn't have been the same book at all, so there's really no point in saying it. But also I kind of feel like if I had been unwilling to grow in some certain kinds of ways personally that I needed to grow in order to explore some of these themes, I mean, if I hadn't been willing to do that, the book would never have been finished, because there was only one way that it could actually, I mean, I feel this way about everything I write, that like I'm sort of on a journey to figuring out the only way that it can end, the only way that the story can be told and be complete. And so um, I don't know, I think sometimes our writing can actually be a really wonderful uh, gift, I guess, that like can push us in the direction of learning the things that we need to learn in our own lives, which is not to say that it should be like a substitute for therapy, because God knows therapy is very, has been very important for me as well. And we need to often work out things there before we work them out on the page. But like, sometimes, I don't know, I think of my writing sometimes as like, I can give gifts to the characters that I also need to give to myself. Uh, I don't know how else to say that or if it makes any sense, but I guess it makes sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, this is a somewhat personal question, but I feel like for other writers that are possibly going through this, I was sort of curious about what it was like for you to actually come out during being a published author, going from the last book to this book, and sort of like if you have guidance for other writers who, are thinking of doing this but feel like they don't know how to, given that they've already published a book with their dead name, and how did you navigate that? And I imagine that must have just been, I just can't even imagine how difficult. I know that's like a trite way to respond to that, but that must have just been really difficult. And I wonder how, how your agent and all the other parts of your team that help you, how you sort of worked through that.
Yeah, actually, that's a really important point. I mean, I feel like when I was doing it, when I was trying to figure out how to do it, I was really lucky in that there were a couple of other authors that were just doing it. I think one of them was Daniel Ortberg, who I think now may go by Daniel Lavery. I'm not sure, but he had just recently come out, and I remember sort of trying to find examples, including him, to give to my agent and be like, here's how this has been handled. I mean, and they hadn't, my editor and my agent hadn't yet, I don't think, had any other clients do this, clients or authors do this. But what was interesting was, I had the same editor for my first book as for my second book, and this book had already sold. And what was interesting was, I sort of handled this in phases. I had a lot of fear at the time about it. I mean, I toured for my first book knowing that I was trans, having already told, my new name and pronouns to my friends and family, and having changed my appearance and still like letting people dead name me because I hadn't told anybody publicly, right? Um, Mostly because I was afraid that I would tank the sales of the first book. And that was difficult. I think I emotionally sort of tuned out how I was feeling about it and tried to just ride the like adrenaline of the book tour and just not think about it. And then later that year, when this book sold, at that time I was aware, I was like, okay, this book is definitely going to be about a trans person. And I'm going to have to probably, well, I don't know, I wanted to tell my editor and my agent that this was the deal. And so like, I did, when we sort of presented the book, when we went to sell the book, I was like, okay, I'm willing to share this information, that like, I'm not just a cis person writing about trans people. I am a trans person. And my editor, who again, like I had known for several years at this point and worked with on another book, was amazing about the whole thing. And obviously, like, I feel really lucky that that was the case. And I think that my entire team of people that I worked with at Atria and also my agent, like, have been amazing about like seeking out resources to educate themselves also, and being willing to like listen and being willing to learn, and have done an amazing job at that. And for that, I'm very grateful. And I do think if there was one thing that I was going to sort of do over again, it would be to understand that like I could have actually asked, I could have not asked for more. How do I say this? I could have sort of taken things at a pace, at the pace that I wanted to take them at. There, I think I had a lot of fear about like, well, maybe I should wait because the paperback of the first book is coming out, and it wasn't until the third edition of the paperback that they could change my name because of when I had let them know. So that wasn't their fault. but I had all these fears and about sales and about everything. And, you know, in the end, like my editor just told me, she was like, very gently, she was like, you know, you don't have to like wait to make some big, like to release an essay about the fact that you're doing this, or to like make some big, you can just do it. Like you can do it whenever you feel comfortable. And so I did. Like I just did. It was like February in 2019, and I just sort of made an announcement on social media and was like, that's that. And everybody supported me and was like, we're with you. We're fine with it. Um, and of course, like maybe I've lost some readers, but you know, in the end, like I also gained so many new readers that it's like I would want to go back and tell my, you know, previous self, like, you're worrying about the wrong things. Like you have so much other stuff on your plate with the transition, that like you deserve to just be able to go at the pace that's comfortable for you. So I think that that's the advice that I would give folks, is also to be like, yeah, get your team on board and tell them, you know, but that people can also surprise you with how supportive they can be. And I do have a lot of hope that the publishing industry is, there's more, let's say there's more and more people in publishing that are supportive of trans people, even as there's some very publicly, you know, vocally transphobic people. There's also like a surprising and growing number of folks who are very willing to support trans writers and want trans books to be published and to be marketed well, and you know, to have support behind them. So yeah, that was my journey, and I hope that other folks that are gonna, you know, writers that are maybe early career or mid-career that are thinking of coming out, I hope it's heartening to them too. I was heartened by people that came before me. So
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I'm also thinking about like Elliot Page coming out, and just like the more these things happen, you know, the better it ends up being for other people to feel safe to come into it. So that's incredible though, that you were able to
totally.
get the support. And you answered another question. I was wondering like when were they able to reprint the first book with your name? And so that's great too. Okay, other questions. So I have a question about blood. I'm just
Let's curious, do it.
Because literally have the word like themes of faith and then blood right underneath it. Okay. So I mean, I'm curious about it for a number of reasons. You know, certainly as a person who's assigned female at birth, you know, I feel like one of the things you're never allowed to talk about, or has been something that's been like culturally you're not allowed to talk about, is anything related to like menstruation, anything related to menstrual bleeding. And the bleeding that happens in this book is obviously different, right? It's the result of, can we just talk about this? The result of the result of an IUD, and but also because the you know, the scenes of bleeding do happen throughout the book. I'm wondering, like, what do you feel the symbolism is around bleeding in general, and how does it kind of relate to other aspects of the book too?
Yeah, this is also something no one has asked me about, so I'm like, oh, I get to talk about. All right, because similarly, no one asked me about this with the first book, but there's also menstrual bleeding in the first book. So apparently, I remember thinking too, like, are people gonna just be like, you can't include this in the, but I did. And I put it in here too. And I mean, I think it started originally because what I wanted to talk about was the way that AFAB people assigned female at birth, in general, are like often just not listened to in terms of them, like listened to by their doctors, listened to even in like a gynecological medicine context, reproductive medicine context. They're not listened to about their own bodies. And that, like, that's true obviously of cis women, but it's also very true for trans people. I do think that, you know, gosh, I mean, I guess what I was trying to have an opportunity to talk about in the book was how difficult it is to get reproductive health care as a transmasculine person. And that even when you can access it, which is not true for all of us, often, you know, either you're not listened to in terms of what's actually best for your body, or when you have complications or you're in pain, there's just this lack of care. And some people have actually flagged this in the book as medical neglect. And I don't think that I would argue with that. I think that you could look at it very much that way. And of course, like the character eventually finds a way to deal with this issue of having this IUD that is causing all of these side effects, and that like at the beginning of the book, and I don't think this is a spoiler, it's in like this first or second scene, he tries to get it removed and the doctor is basically like, oh, you know, you're fine, you're gonna be fine, just like give it some time. And he's like, I'm really suffering, but he's not listened to. And what I kind of love about this is like, I mean, one of the things that is often taboo, even among, I think among trans people, like I think that among transmasculine people, especially for like, I don't know, well, let's just say that among transmasculine people in general, it can be very taboo to talk about the fact that like a lot of us do get periods. And like even those of us who don't want to or are told medically like, well, you shouldn't on this particular whatever medication or testosterone or whatever, like, you shouldn't get a period, but like a lot of us do anyway. It can be really hard to like find space to talk about that without somebody immediately just being like, well, but see, you're a woman and so whatever, and like being super transphobic about it because of, you know, menstruation being equated with womanhood in this super transphobic way. And so I kind of love the fact that you have this character who is a trans guy, who's a non-binary transmasculine person, more specifically, who does all of these things and goes on this entire quest in this book while he's bleeding, yeah. Right? And that doesn't invalidate his gender. And it's never actually in the book, like it's a source of dysphoria for him in certain ways, and it's certainly a source of discomfort, but it's not something that he views as invalidating what his gender is. And yeah, I just don't, I mean, I don't think that I've actually seen like a transmasculine person menstruating on the page, but like that is part of, and it's not a part of everybody's experience, but it is a part of my experience of my own body. And I just think, I don't know, I guess I just thought like, well, why can't I talk about this? You know?
No, I really love it, actually. I think you're right, too, in the sense that that is part of like the transmasculine experience that doesn't get discussed for a number of reasons. But I was also thinking about, let me leap into faith conversation. But I was thinking about some of the things I read about, you know, different religions or different spiritual faiths that, you know, that there are certain, I'm very like not well educated on most of them, but not being able to pray or going into temple if you've been menstruating, that even like, you know, that there's like that connection too, even though this isn't the reason he's bleeding isn't because he's menstruating, but that there's certainly like a relationship there too. And I was just wondering if that was at all an aspect of I mean, what I think is interesting about the fact that he bleeds through so much of the book is also that he doesn't talk about it very often, right? There's a lot of like keeping the pain to himself, so that he's having this that he is suffering and is sort of attempting to look like he's not suffering.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that was just this is going to sound so bad, but like part of that is such a part of my experience of dealing with my own body and being trans and being AFAB and like having, I mean, I have endometriosis and like, I don't think there's anything taboo. There shouldn't be anything taboo about saying that, right? There's like so many people that have it, but like, yeah, that's like true to life, right? That like so many of us do sort of suffer silently for so many reasons. And And certainly like in terms of faith stuff, I mean, also in Islam, you know, if you have your period, you sort of can't attain a state of like religious like purification, let's say. So like when you, before you pray, you have to purify yourself with water, or with, there are other ways of doing it, but primarily you know, wash yourself. We call it wudu, is the process of like washing yourself before you pray. And if you are menstruating, it's, you just can't, you can't attain the state that you are supposed to be in order to pray. And so, you know, but then there's, so like that's something that is, you know, relevant to what this character is experiencing. But there's also the fact that, and this I think is much more sort of present in his mind, because it's something that's more immediate for what he's going through with trying to figure out if he should come out in terms of his gender. The fact that like he has this moment where he's trying to figure out like, well, if I pray, like, should I cover my head? Should I not cover my head? You know, is it more important my experience of my gender or other people's experience of my gender? How am I going to pray with other people now? How do I approach God or the divine? How do I find a new relationship with the divine? And I think like that is, I mean, ultimately, like that is kind of the thing that ties a lot of the stuff in the book together and a lot of the characters in the book together, that in some way, most, maybe not all, but like almost all of the characters in the book are seeking out some form of the divine. And a lot of them, you know, some of them are seeking it out in an external way. Like it's really early on in the book, it's said that, you know, Layla Z's mother, for example, is seen as this very religious woman, but she actually is having an internal crisis of faith where she is so struggling with her doubt that she has been praying, and she's so Layla Z's family is Christian, I should say. So like her mother has been praying to God to show her an angel as like a sign that there is a God. And there are spoilers in that, you know, I won't go further than that, but let's just say that she's seeking that out. And that also, you know, Nadar's search for the divine is sort of internal, where he wants to access something that is sacred or wordless in his own experience of his, let's say, his embodiment or like his presence in the world. He's trying to figure out how to sort of get beyond the body and the language that we use to describe the body, in order to feel that he can access something more true that lies behind it. And one of the ways he does that is through art, because that's a way of accessing the wordless. But there's a lot of different ways that he sort of goes about that. But I do think that it's really like, that's not an easy thing to talk about even now, you know, like that it's still very, I think it can still feel very like taboo or scary for trans people to say, you know, that our lives can be sacred, or that our that like we could feel the presence of the divine in our lives, or even in our own bodies, that we could feel sacred in that way, I think is, you know, for a lot of people is just like off the table. But it was something that I wanted to explore. I think sometimes like language got in the way of that, as it often does, you know, which I think is why there's so much discussion of that sort of angst over language and trying to escape language, and not just the language that we use for what we know, but also the language that other people use to describe us. And so now I'm going off on a tangent, but
I was actually thinking, we were talking about, you know, this idea of like pushing against the queer and trans tragic narrative, but I also feel like another way to push against that is like the relationship of queerness and transness to religion, and not making that also always this like tragic, you know, sort of story, which is another way that often happens, where the person is cut off from religion, or having to hide it from the people whom they practice their faith with, or their family members. So I also really love that about the book as well. Let me see if I have. Oh, so these are just like fun questions that I was thinking about, so I had no idea that you were this like phenomenal visual artist until very recently. So I was wondering, did you explore visually, like, the bird narrative, and was there ever a conversation around including any like illustrations throughout the book, because there's so much around the visual artistry of the bird itself, not just the physical bird.
I mean, that would have been really cool. I won't lie. It crossed my mind where I was like, oh, it would be so awesome. But, I think it seemed clear to me pretty early on that like that would just be on the level of like production, like it'd be really expensive. And so we couldn't do that. But one cool thing that we were able to do was that like right around, well, actually, we put this together before I left the States before the pandemic. So this was like January or February of 2020. Time has no
I
meaning.
know.
Of 2020. And I basically was like in our sort of pre marketing meeting, I was like, well, like if you think it could be cool, I've been drawing birds for like 2 years as a way of sort of getting into this character, and I have a bunch of illustrations, like if they're useful. And somebody on the marketing team came up with the idea that we could make like posters that we could send out to book bloggers and bookstagrammers and stuff, and that's what we ended up doing. And that was kind of cool that
That's
I
amazing.
started seeing like my illustration of the yellow crowned night heron like popping up on Instagram, like on people's desks. I was like, this is wild. Like so.
Oh, that's amazing. I mean, can I ask you like your like artistic journey? Like, did you start with writing or did you start with visual art? And um, was that like a decision you needed, like that you made at some point, that you were going to pursue writing over the other?
Well, I guess, I mean, so my dad was a visual artist. He was a painter. And I enjoyed painting and drawing, mostly drawing, from the time that I was really little. But I suppose I mean, yeah, there were, I entered into contests and I like, but I was never trained in it. And so like a lot of other things that I sort of dabbled in, and maybe even more than dabbled in, like I also, like I used to, sing semi-professionally, and I
Bring
was
that up.
trained, and like, I mean, and I loved it, right? Like I love those things. But at some point I guess I knew that writing was something that I guess it was more emotionally like, how do I say this? I want to say like it was more sort of emotionally supportive or somehow like important, but what I actually mean is that I couldn't not do it. Like I was like addicted to it in a way where I wasn't with some of the other things that I enjoyed. And so like writing was something that I did even when I was like in graduate school getting I have a PhD in genetics, and that was my sort of first career. Like even when I was in that super busy, difficult period, I was still writing just because I felt that I had to, or my brain would just become like cluttered or something. Um, so I think, yeah, with writing, it was just on another level. It was like writing was something that is something that I do because that's how I make sense of the world, especially through fiction. Um, I can't give it up. Like there have been periods where I've tried, I just can't. Whereas like other things like visual art, I really love it. And with singing too, like I love it and it brings me great joy and peace a lot of the time. But um, I will go periods where I may not sort of pursue it as much. Whereas with writing, it's more of a constant. So I think it's just sort of, I don't know, this was a nice opportunity to get to return to that, I think.
Yeah, that's amazing. The only other question, it's not really a question. I love the way that food enters the book. And I was curious about, so first of all, I was curious if you actually know how to make all of those things, or if this was something that like watched and read about. Certainly like from a cultural standpoint, like as like an immigrant child, that anytime, food is just like so important to so many like immigrant cultures, and there's so much that's being said emotionally, and there's such connectivity that happens around sharing food. But what I really love about the way that food enters this book is that we also get to see the process of actually preparing it, when they're in, you know, when they're baking the desserts especially. And so I was wondering about, you know, like what food means in the book, and if that was like lived experience, or if this was something that you sort of looked into to integrate in like a more tactile way.
Yeah, I mean, all of the food stuff was was basically lived experience. I mean, I cook a lot, and I have made the things that are described in the book, and I think that's the scene in particular that you're referring to. I don't think it's a spoiler, right? But
Yeah.
like, so like when these two characters, let's say, when these two characters are baking together, like the thing that I really love about that scene, and I think this is maybe the thing I love about the inclusion of food in general, because there's also the scene where Nadar is like doing either cooking or like sort of is in the kitchen with his grandmother, with his teta. What I like about those scenes, and I think that what I was trying to get at in a more emotional or thematic level, is that um, I wanted to talk about some of the parts of what it can be like to be an AFAB person and be included in certain kinds of sisterhoods or certain kinds of all female spaces, but being a transmasculine person and the very particular sort of unique pain and angst that can also come with that, where like especially when one is closeted and is sort of feeling like these spaces are important to me, they're what I know, and yet there's something very invalidating or there's something very alienating about this, because I know that I don't have the same experiences and certainly don't have the same sort of experience of my own gender as the cis women that I'm in the space with. But I think the exception, like the slight twist to that, let's say, is that scene with Sabah where they're baking is really cool, because Sabah is later described or is sort of hinted at as being a queer woman herself. It's unclear whether she is like open about that to any degree. Certainly she doesn't come out to any of the characters in the book, but there's just this sort of quiet understanding when Nadar changes his gender presentation, she stops using pronouns for him. She's just sort of, there's an understanding there that other characters don't have. Mm-hmm. And there, it's even hinted that she may not be cis, and we don't actually know. Like, we never find out. But there's this wonderful way in which they're sharing this moment where they're both of these characters are AFAB, but neither of them are straight, and it may be that neither of them are cis, and they're still sharing this what would otherwise be considered a very gendered space and a very gendered activity. And I think what I like about that is that it leaves open the possibility that some of these spaces and activities that are sort of described often or thought of by the cis heteropatriarchy as being specific to like cis sisterhood, they don't have to be that way, you know? And I really like that.
Yeah, I really love it too. Like, I mean, especially baking, right? Of all things, you know, that it really like queering.
Am I frozen? Oh no.
Yeah, you are. Can you hear me? Oh, there you are. Okay. Can you, no, just like, I just love the queer.
Yeah, you just came back.
Okay. No, I was just going to say that I really love the queering of baking, especially because I feel like baking is just so gendered, you know, the association of it. And it's interesting because it's not really an experience that, I mean, my father mostly raised us, and, you know, like one of the most like kind of like vivid memories I have of him is him wearing this like huge floral apron, like over his like pot belly, like
that.
making cheesecakes for our bake sales, you know? So, so it's also like, I've never actually had that experience, but there's so much of that, like that feminized language around it that that I love the sight of it as like a site of like, you know, just like a non-normative connection in particular. I think that's my last question. Hold on, thank you so much. I'm gonna stop the recording really quick. Hold on.
Sure.